is Feyisayo Aluko from Oral History presenting The House I Return to. Okay.
For the last 7 years, almost every single night, I dreamt about my secondary school in Nigeria, which is the equivalent of the 7th to the 12th grade here in the US. Now, my secondary school experience wasn't that important, but for some reason, I kept on coming back to it. And I realized that it wasn't just me. And so I set out to figure out what about secondary schools was so pivotal in the minds of Nigerians. To that effect, I conducted oral history interviews with people who'd graduated from secondary schools in the 2010s, but then also in the 50s and 60s to compare their experiences. I asked them questions about their everyday lives, the relationships they had to each other, what they did for fun, but I also asked them to reflect on what the country had become after they graduated. Now, oral history interviews are typically 2 to 3 hours long, and they allow for the meandering, cyclical nature of memory. This was pivotal to my research because it allowed for my narrators to make meaning of the stories that they were telling me. And so I collected these stories into a documentary film featuring recreations of those memories as well as the interviews as pictured above. And what I found that I thought was so interesting was that secondary schools function almost as like a microcosm for the nation. It was in secondary schools that my narrators first began to rehearse their relationships to the country. So things like civic engagement, shared responsibility, it was in secondary schools that this was being acted upon. I also found that there was an intergenerational conversation happening between my narrators, even though they had never actually formally spoken to each other. For both generations, it was like they were retelling me the exact same memory. And this is because Nigerian secondary schools have a structured and hierarchical nature to them, so that depending on the curriculum and socioeconomic class of the school, students were being formed in a specific direction. And so, at this point, my research question changed. It was no longer why secondary school was so important to Nigerians, but how it was forming people in a specific direction. I found that stricter schools that ran national curriculums formed children that grew up to be more apathetic towards politics and towards their country. Schools that had international curriculums formed students who did feel a burden for their nation, as I did, because I was dreaming about it, but students who were ultimately positioned to leave the country. And so, even though I didn't realize exactly why I was dreaming about secondary school, I did come to a conclusion that I think is important and would like to share with you all. And that is that our institutions shape the way we relate to our nation, whether or not we realize it. For Nigerians, it was secondary school that shaped us, but every single person here is actively being shaped by the institutions they went through. And so my hope for this film and for the thesis is that it gives you all a framework to think about how you have been shaped by your institutions.